Have you ever wondered what secrets lie behind the quietest corners of a seemingly peaceful farm? What happens when the line between faith and fear blurs and a soul disappears without a trace? In the shadows of an isolated Amish community, could tradition hide something far more sinister? Tonight, we uncover the chilling story of Margaret Hale. Was she merely a visitor, or the next in a chain of lost souls? Are you ready to step into the silence and find out what watches in the shadows? If you want more stories like this one, forgotten, silenced, and those we should never forget, subscribe to the channel. The next case might already be knocking at your door. The wind carried a peculiar chill the day Margaret Hale arrived in Berne, Indiana. Autumn had already begun its slow retreat, leaving the fields in muted golds and browns, the corn husks brittle underfoot. The dirt road leading to the Kreider farm stretched out like a ribbon, swallowed by the horizon, flanked on both sides by dense clusters of maples and oaks. Margaret, carrying a small satchel and a folded bundle of letters, felt the weight of isolation pressing against her chest the moment she stepped from the wagon. The farmhouse, a sturdy structure of timber and stone, seemed welcoming at first glance, yet its very stillness suggested a careful restraint, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets too fragile to speak. The first person she encountered was Mrs. Yoder, a woman whose face bore the carved lines of decades under the sun, her eyes calm but distant, measuring Margaret with a scrutiny that made her stomach tighten. "You will find work here," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "but do not expect the world to be as it seems." Margaret nodded, unsure if it was a warning or simply the cadence of a peculiar dialect. There was a tension in the air, unspoken, tangible, as though the very earth beneath her feet was waiting. The other members of the Kreider household were present yet absent. Mr. Kreider, tall and stoic, moved with slow deliberation through the kitchen, stacking wood and arranging bowls of dried fruit without acknowledging her beyond a curt nod. The children, pale and quiet, avoided her gaze, their small hands clutching one another as they passed through the room. There was a rhythm to the household, an unyielding order Margaret felt in her bones but could not yet name. Even the animals seemed to move with a deliberate, hushed caution, the cows shifting in the barn with a careful weight, the chickens pausing mid-step as if aware of an invisible presence. Margaret's first night was the hardest. She lay on the narrow cot assigned to her in the corner of the guest room, the wind rattling the shutters as the house settled in the dark. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the sighing of a timber beam, the distant call of an owl, seemed magnified, echoing through the empty spaces of the house. It was not fear that held her awake, but a gnawing unease, a sense that she had crossed an invisible threshold into a world where observation itself carried weight. Outside, the orchard stood silent, trees like sentinels, their gnarled branches casting skeletal shadows across the snowless ground. Occasionally, a low whistle of air would cut through the stillness, a sound so human it startled her into believing someone was there. Though when she peered through the window, the fields were empty, the horizon unbroken. Breakfast the next morning was a study in precision. The table, rough-hewn but polished, held porridge in plain bowls, butter, and a small loaf of dark bread. Margaret watched as the Kreiders ate in quiet synchrony, every motion measured. Words were sparse, and when they spoke, their voices were careful, as if each syllable had been weighed against some invisible ledger. Mr. Kreider finally addressed her, voice calm, yet carrying an undertone she could not place. "You will work with care, and you will watch. Some things must be kept just so, or the land will remember differently." Margaret nodded again, sensing that this was more than a simple instruction. There was a ritual here, unspoken, observed in silence, in the cadence of the farm's daily operations. By noon, Margaret had begun her tasks, tending the animals, sweeping the floors, fetching water from the well. The rhythm of labor was grounding, yet each glance at the edges of the farm stirred unease. Fences marked boundaries not merely of property, but of something subtler, deeper. She noticed, for the first time, that the children avoided certain paths. The orchard, in particular, where the ground seemed too dark, the shadows too long. Mrs. Yoder, noticing her gaze, simply shook her head. "Some corners are not for eyes that wander." The words lingered like a chant, and Margaret felt that the farm itself was watching, waiting to see what she would do next. As dusk fell, the fields were swallowed by the fog creeping from the nearby forest. The sun's last rays cut through in pale, trembling streaks, illuminating dust motes that drifted through the cabin windows. The sound of the wind had changed. It no longer whispered but carried a low, almost vocal resonance, as if the trees themselves were murmuring. Margaret closed the door to her room, yet the sensation of being observed did not relent. In the quiet of the farmhouse, she understood that she had arrived not merely to work, but to inhabit a space where silence itself was a language, and where the smallest movement might awaken something long dormant. The night deepened, and with it, a subtle but insistent pressure in the air. Outside, the fields lay flat and empty, yet Margaret felt the weight of unseen eyes, waiting, calculating. The moon rose pale and full over the treetops, casting the orchard in a spectral glow. Somewhere in the distance, a gate creaked, though the wind was still. Margaret shivered, pulling the thin blanket closer around her shoulders. In that moment, she understood that she had stepped into a world governed by rules unspoken and histories unremembered. A world where every corner of the farm, every shadow between the trees, carried the potential to unsettle her understanding of reality itself. And as the house settled in the relentless quiet of the night, Margaret felt the first true stirrings of a fear that had no shape, no sound, and no end. It was a presence that would follow her, patient and inexorable, into the days to come. The silence of the farm was not emptiness, it was vigilance, and Margaret had entered its orbit. Margaret Hale awoke to the dim light of morning filtering through the narrow window of her room. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of frost and damp earth. She rose quietly, mindful of the household's unspoken expectation that one's presence should not disturb the rhythm of the farm. Breakfast was served in silence, save for the occasional scrape of spoon against bowl. Mr. Creeder's eyes, dark and calculating, watched her from across the table, his expression unreadable. The children sat in rigid rows, their faces pale and composed, echoing the stoicism of their father. Margaret's spoon trembled slightly as she lifted it to her lips, aware of a subtle weight pressing down upon her, a pressure not rooted in words, but in the expectation of observation, of being measured in the smallest detail. After the meal, she was given her first proper tasks: to sweep the floorboards of the main hall, feed the chickens, and tend to the cows in the barn. The work itself was not difficult, yet it carried a rhythm that Margaret felt in her bones, a cadence that was almost ritualistic. Each motion, each measured step, seemed to adhere to rules she could not name, rules she had not been taught, but that the farm itself seemed to demand. She noticed, with a growing unease, that the paths between the buildings and the fields were rigidly defined. The children avoided certain areas of the orchard, skirting the edges of the fields with silent, deliberate steps, as though aware of invisible boundaries. When Margaret's gaze lingered on one particular stretch of land, Mrs. Yoder approached her without a word and gestured toward the far edge of the orchard. "Some places are not for wandering," she said softly, almost as if confessing a truth too fragile to hold. Curiosity mingled with apprehension as Margaret completed her chores. She felt drawn to the orchard, to the whispering of the wind through the skeletal branches of the trees. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Yoder invited her for a walk. The woman moved slowly, deliberately, and Margaret fell into step beside her, feeling both honored and uncertain. "The wind carries messages," Mrs. Yoder said quietly, her eyes fixed on the gnarled trees ahead. "It tells of those who have walked before, of what has been taken, and what remains." Margaret listened but understood little, only sensing the gravity in the woman's voice. As they walked, the earth beneath their feet bore marks unfamiliar to her, depressions, scrapes, and uneven trails that suggested something, or someone, had been dragged across the ground during the night. The patterns were irregular, chaotic, yet intentional, like a language she had yet to decipher. By evening, Margaret returned to the farmhouse with a sense of both awe and unease. The chores had been completed, yet the weight of the day lingered like a shadow along her spine. She noticed the children retreating quickly indoors, their hurried steps silent on the wooden planks, and she realized that dusk brought more than fading light. It brought caution, even fear. The farmhouse, though seemingly ordinary in its daily routines, seemed to shift subtly as the sun descended. Shadows stretched and deepened, filling the corners of the rooms with a quiet insistence, and the wind carried with it a low hum, almost as if the farm itself were holding its breath. That night, Margaret lay on her cot, the blanket drawn tightly around her shoulders. She recalled the orchard and the strange impressions in the soil, the words of Mrs. Yoder, the measured glances of the Kreider children, the silence of the farm pressed down upon her, not as emptiness, but as vigilance, as though the land, the trees, the very house were watching, recording, and waiting. Somewhere beyond the walls, the wind whispered secrets she could not yet comprehend. Each creak of timber, each distant howl of animal, felt amplified in the stillness, echoing against the walls of her mind. Sleep came slowly, reluctant, and even as her eyelids closed, Margaret sensed the weight of observation, the careful attention of forces unseen, lingering just beyond the edges of perception. Margaret awoke intermittently throughout the night to faint sounds, the scuffle of hooves, the distant clatter of a gate swinging in the wind, and a soft, almost human murmur that seemed to emanate from the orchard. She would lie still, heart pounding, listening to the rhythm of the farm, feeling the careful choreography of life here, ordered yet unsettling. Each time she drifted toward sleep, a question pressed against her mind. What had she entered, and what would the silence demand from her in return? The ordinary work of the farm, the sweeping of floors, the care of animals, all seemed to conceal another layer of reality, one she had only begun to sense. It was in the careful avoidance of certain paths, the muted glances, and the whispered warnings that the true character of this place revealed itself, not through overt danger, but through the suffocating weight of unspoken rules. As the first light of dawn approached, Margaret understood that she was no longer merely a visitor in this world. She was a participant in its rigid, unyielding order, and the land around her seemed to hum with quiet expectation. The ordinary, she realized, was merely a veil, behind which something watched patiently, waiting for her to act, to stumble, or to acknowledge the boundaries that had long been set by those who came before. In the silence, the ordinary became sinister, and the day's labor, though mundane in its appearance, carried the potential to reveal truths too uncomfortable to name aloud. The nights in the Kreider farm stretched long and unbroken, as if time itself had slowed, allowing every small sound to swell into significance. Margaret Hale lay awake more nights than she cared to admit, listening to the house breathe around her. The wind pressed against the shutters, carrying with it a soft, eerie resonance, a rhythm almost like a voice trying to shape itself into words. She told herself it was only the wind, that the isolation of the farm had unmoored her senses, yet the unease that curled around her chest was relentless. She had entered a world where silence was not emptiness, but communication, where even the smallest gesture was recorded in a ledger she could not see. One night, as the moon hung low and silver above the orchard, Margaret heard the first whisper. It came from the barn, faint but distinct, a shifting, almost deliberate rustle, as though someone or something was moving between the stalls. She froze, the blanket heavy in her hands, her heart a timid drum. The animals had been settled hours before. No one should have been there. She told herself to ignore it, to sleep, yet curiosity gnawed at her resolve. Drawing the thin curtains aside, she caught sight of a shadow, long and tentative, slipping across the wooden planks. It did not move like a person, not entirely. It seemed to hesitate with the air itself, bending the space around it in a subtle distortion that made Margaret's stomach coil with dread. Morning brought no relief, only the weight of continuity. Breakfast was quiet, measured, with the same attention to order that had become suffocating in its precision. Mr. Kreider's eyes lingered on her with a scrutiny that suggested both calculation and warning. He spoke at last, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent Margaret could not place. "Now that you are here, you will see how the work keeps the farm true," he said, "and how some things must stay outside the door." Margaret hesitated, unsure whether he spoke literally or in a sense that stretched beyond her comprehension. The children ate silently, their small faces mirrors of their father's stoicism, their eyes occasionally darting to the edges of the room as if to measure what they could not name. As she tended the animals that day, Margaret's unease deepened. Each movement through the barn and fields was observed not only by the Criders, but by something she could not define. Shadows moved strangely in her peripheral vision, and the air often carried a scent she could not identify, earthy, cold, and faintly metallic. The orchard, in particular, drew her attention. The ground seemed to bear the weight of unseen feet, pressed into the soil in patterns too deliberate to be random. When she approached, she caught glimpses of what might have been depressions or scrapes, long lines etched into the earth as though something had been dragged across the ground. She stepped back, heart thundering, aware of the hush that seemed to follow her movement, as if the land itself was holding its breath. That evening, Mrs. Yoder approached her quietly in the corner of the kitchen. Her gaze was steady, her tone deliberate. "The farm remembers," she said softly. "It knows who walks in and who passes out, and it never forgets the ones who have been lost." Margaret swallowed, understanding only part of the words, but sensing their weight in the silence between them. She returned to her room, the shadows of the orchard pressing against her thoughts, and found herself drawn toward the strange impression she had seen earlier. Something had passed through the space she thought she knew, leaving traces in both earth and memory, and the house, the children, even the wind seemed attuned to the intrusion. The first whisper returned that night, more insistent, almost a voice. It slithered along the floorboards and wrapped itself around her ears, hinting at knowledge she was not ready to hold. Margaret lay frozen, waiting for it to stop, waiting for understanding. But the sound persisted, threading through the quiet of the house like a secret too vital to reveal. Somewhere beyond the walls, the wind had changed. It now carried a hollow resonance, a mournful cadence, as though echoing a memory long buried. The barn, the orchard, the thin stretch of land beyond the fences, all seemed alive with a subtle vigilance, observing her as she struggled to differentiate reality from something else entirely. By midnight, Margaret understood that she was no longer merely a witness in the farm's order. She was a participant. Each sound, each whisper, drew her deeper into a rhythm she did not yet comprehend. The walls themselves seemed to lean closer, the wind pressing in from the orchard, the shadows shifting with deliberate intent. The whisper, now almost a language, brushed the edge of recognition and retreat, leaving her mind suspended between fear and fascination. Sleep came in fragmented intervals, and when she awoke, the sense of being watched had intensified. It was not the eyes of the Criders she felt, but the awareness of the land itself, patient, knowing, and insistent. Margaret realized she had crossed a threshold into a reality where nothing ordinary remained, and the whisper had only begun. Margaret Hale had begun to sense the unspoken hierarchy of the Crider farm, a rhythm imposed not only by labor, but by vigilance, observation, and restraint. Days blurred into the repetition of chores, the sweeping of floors, the careful feeding of animals, yet beneath the mundane, a deeper current pulsed, a quiet insistence that not all spaces were hers to tread, not all times hers to measure. The orchard and the edge of the cornfield became focal points of her unease, a subtle thrum in the land that both drew and repelled her. The children skirted these spaces with an almost ritualized precision, their glances fleeting, sharp, and full of warning. Margaret could not name the rules she was meant to follow, only feel their weight pressing against her chest as though the very earth disapproved of her intrusion. It was during the preparation for the weekly gathering in the farmhouse chapel that the boundaries of this world became painfully clear. The Criders, along with other members of the surrounding community, assembled in austere rows, their bodies straight and their eyes lowered, lips moving in solemn hymns that echoed against the timber walls. Margaret, though not a member of the congregation, was invited to stand at the edge, her presence noted but contained. There was a precision to the movements, the cadence of speech, the timing of breath that felt almost ritualistic, a choreography that demanded her attention. The weight of silence pressed upon her, and with it came the first stark awareness that this was a world governed as much by restraint as by devotion. After the service, a circle of the younger congregation, boys and girls her own age, prepared for the customary evening walk, a solitary vigil through the fields and orchards. each participant reflecting in quiet meditation on their place within the order. Margaret felt a longing to follow, a yearning to pierce the veils of ritual and understand the secret rhythm of this place. She approached Mrs. Yoder, who had guided her gently through the chores earlier in the day, and asked if she might join. The woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing, lips pressed in a line. "Not tonight," she said finally, with a softness that carried steel beneath it. "There are places we do not visit together. Some spaces are not for wandering in company." Margaret nodded, an uneasy shiver threading through her limbs, sensing a line drawn between what she was allowed to witness and what she could not. Later, as twilight softened the edges of the fields, Margaret's curiosity drew her back toward the orchard. She stopped at its threshold, observing a single boy standing beneath the twisted boughs of an ancient tree at the far edge. He was alone, arm raised as if in supplication, his body still against the creeping darkness, a solitary figure in communion with forces she could not name. She watched for several moments, a mixture of awe and dread constricting her chest, before stepping back to the path she knew she was permitted to traverse. That night, the house seemed alive with hushed murmurs that were neither wholly human nor entirely the wind. The children slept with an almost unnatural stillness, the adults breathing deep and synchronized, as though maintaining a rhythm that extended beyond the walls of the house. Margaret lay in her cot, mind restless, the image of the boy under the tree lingering in her thoughts. The sense of exclusion pressed heavily upon her, a subtle reminder that her presence here was conditional, bounded by invisible rules and observances she had yet to fully understand. The moonlight crept through the narrow window, brushing against her hands and face as she turned restlessly under the thin blanket. Outside, the orchard seemed to sway in silent cadence, the branches whispering secrets too subtle to hear and too profound to ignore. Every shadow, every creaking timber in the farmhouse seemed charged with latent meaning, as if the walls themselves were conscious of her intrusion into the sacred rhythms of this place. Margaret felt the compelling tension of forbidden knowledge pressing against the edge of her awareness, a silent insistence that some spaces, some truths, were never meant to be approached without fear, and that curiosity in this land came with a weight heavier than labor, heavier even than isolation itself. Through the night, the whispering of the wind intensified, threading through the orchard and along the edges of the cornfield. It was not words she could grasp, but a cadence, a warning, a presence that stirred beneath the rhythm of the house and the careful order of the children. Margaret realized, as she drifted into uneasy sleep, that the boundaries imposed upon her were not arbitrary, and that stepping beyond them could awaken currents in the land and in the household she was not yet prepared to face. The sacred and the forbidden were closely intertwined here, and the line between them was as fragile and sharp as the moonlight on the gnarled branches of the orchard tree. Margaret Hale had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the farm, yet the sense of unease that had haunted her since her arrival remained persistent, like a shadow following her through every room, every field, every narrow path between buildings. She began to notice the little things that had gone unnoticed before, the furtive glances exchanged among the children, the half-spoken warnings in Mrs. Yoder's voice, the way Mr. Kreider's hand would tremble for a fraction of a second when a question touched too closely on the past. And then there was the attic, a place she had been told not to enter, described as for storage and old memories. Yet the words carried the weight of secrecy, of things carefully tucked away to remain unseen. On one gray afternoon, driven by a curiosity that now felt more like compulsion, Margaret climbed the narrow stairs, her hand trailing along the cold wooden railing, and pushed open the door that led to the musty upper space. The attic was heavy with the smell of dust, wood, and time itself. Boxes and trunks were stacked haphazardly, covered with sheets that had yellowed and frayed at the edges. As she moved between them, a single box, small and unassuming, caught her attention. Its lid bore no inscription, yet when she lifted it, she found folded letters and brittle pages, and on the first of them, a name she knew too well, Margaret Hale. Her pulse quickened, and a chill rose along her spine. She turned the pages carefully, each one telling a fragment of a story, a series of events that mirrored her own arrival, her own movements through the farm, yet tinged with dread and confusion. The letters spoke of disappearances, of whispers in the wind, of a soul deemed lost by those who had watched too closely and too long. Margaret realized, with an almost physical jolt, that she had not merely been brought to the Kreider farm as a helper or worker. She had been called to a position already defined, a role that had been vacated only by absence, by a disappearance that was hushed and forgotten by polite conversation, but remembered in ritual and reverence. The previous Margaret Hale, it seemed, had walked these same rooms, tended the same animals, been cautioned against the same paths, and yet had vanished when the winter wind was strongest. The farm, the orchard, the very land itself appeared to retain the memory of her presence, the residue of a soul that had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Margaret's hands shook as she closed the box, the pages rustling with an almost accusatory insistence, as though the letters themselves were warning her of what awaited. That evening, the wind carried a different note, sharper and more insistent, as if stirred by the revelation of the attic's secret. Margaret moved through the house with a new awareness, the shadows lengthened by the lowering light, taking on a different significance. The children's hushed movements seemed now to hold an unspoken urgency, a recognition of the lineage of absences that Margaret was only beginning to grasp. Mrs. Yoder's gaze lingered on her more than usual, faintly approving, yet weighted with an undercurrent of caution. "You see what must not be forgotten," she said softly, and Margaret felt the words strike her like a bell tolling in the distance, a reminder that knowledge was a burden, and understanding carried responsibility. Margaret began to piece together fragments of the past, the strange rituals at the orchard, the careful avoidance of certain paths, the stories the children whispered when she could not hear, the insistence on silence at night. Every detail seemed to converge toward the fate of the previous Margaret Hale, and Margaret felt the first true shiver of fear, not for herself alone, but for the weight she had inherited, the expectation of a soul observed and measured by the land and the community alike. That night, the wind rose high and the house seemed to tremble with its sighs. Margaret lay in her cot, listening to the hum of the wind and the low murmurs of the distant fields. She imagined the previous Margaret wandering, seeking, and finally disappearing into the endless winter, leaving behind only the faintest traces on soil, wood, and memory. Margaret understood that the farm was more than a place of labor. It was a crucible, a keeper of stories and souls, and she was now entwined with both. The house breathed around her, alive with the residue of absence, and the orchard's trees whispered in languages she could not yet comprehend. Sleep was tentative, fragmented by a sense that something waited in the liminal spaces of the farm, just beyond the threshold of perception. She could not shake the image of the lost soul, pale and silent, its presence folded into the land itself. The weight of inheritance pressed down upon her, and she realized that her arrival had not ended with the ordinary tasks of the day, but had begun a reckoning with the echoes of those who had come before, the first of many awakenings that the silence of the Kreider farm would demand. The first snow arrived with a quiet ferocity, covering the fields in a thick, unbroken white that reflected the pale light of the moon. Margaret Hale had never known such isolation. The trees, bare and skeletal, loomed like silent sentinels over the frosted land. Every familiar path vanished beneath the snow, leaving her disoriented as she moved from the farmhouse to the barn, her boots sinking slightly into the unyielding surface. The wind carried with it a biting cold, sharp and insistent, yet beneath it lingered a softer, almost vocal murmur, a resonance she could not attribute to the storm alone. Even the animals seemed to sense the change, their low murmurs of discomfort punctuating the otherwise frozen silence. Margaret felt a rising unease, a sense that the land itself was waiting for something long overdue, an expectancy that pressed against her chest with the weight of inevitability. The evening had been long with chores that seemed both ordinary and strange under the thickening snow. As she returned from the barn, Margaret noticed something peculiar. The tracks she left behind were interrupted, broken in a way that suggested another presence had passed through, yet she saw nothing. Her pulse quickened. The stillness of the surrounding fields, normally so predictable, was disturbed by a subtle, irregular pressure in the air, as if something invisible had moved in tandem with her steps. The wind whispered against the eaves of the farmhouse in low, fractured tones, carrying hints of language she could not understand, messages folded into the gusts like secrets the world was reluctant to share. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and hurried inside, yet the sensation of being observed persisted, deepening with each breath she took. That night, the house settled into its usual rhythm of shadows and creaking timbers, but Margaret's awareness had sharpened. Every sound became a potential signal, every shift of the wind or flap of the shutters a portent. At the edge of sleep, she thought she heard footsteps in the snow outside, soft and deliberate, moving along paths that had been cleared only hours before. When she pressed herself against the cold window pane, the yard lay empty, undisturbed except for her own tracks, half covered by drifting snow. The momentary relief of solitude was shattered by the realization that the snow, a blanket that should have provided comfort, instead concealed traces of something else. The patterns, irregular and fleeting, suggested presence without revealing identity, a reminder that the farm was never truly empty, and the white fields were a stage for events she had yet to understand. Morning revealed further anomalies. Tracks led from the barn into the forest, stopping abruptly at the edge where the trees rose like walls. Margaret followed them briefly, heart pounding, but found only the pale, unbroken snow beyond, a threshold that seemed to swallow movement entirely. Mr. Kreider, observing from the kitchen, noted her inquiry with a brief, almost imperceptible nod. "Do not look to the south of the forest after nightfall," he said. There was no explanation, no inflection beyond the words themselves, yet they carried a weight that demanded compliance. Margaret felt the world narrow to the rhythm of the snow-covered farm, where boundaries were measured not only by fences and trees, but by the absence of understanding, the silence of what could not be questioned. Throughout that day, she moved with a heightened vigilance, every glance to the horizon tinged with anxiety. The wind carried persistent whispers, indistinct yet intimate, threading between the trees and drifting across the snow in undulating currents. Margaret felt drawn to the orchard, where the ground held impressions in the snow, subtle depressions that suggested movement yet yielded no origin. She knelt to examine them, tracing the contours with her fingers, sensing that the traces belonged to more than the animals or the wind. There was intention in them, a deliberate disruption of the pristine field, and with it, an implicit message that she had arrived too late to witness the beginning, yet too early to escape what was unfolding. As night fell once more, the wind intensified, curling through the corners of the house with an almost deliberate insistence. Margaret sat huddled beneath a thin blanket, listening to the subtle shifts in air and snow, realizing that the farm was not simply a place of work, but a living archive of presence and absence. Each flake that landed, each whisper that passed, seemed to carry the memory of those who had moved here before her, of those who had vanished and left behind only traces in the earth and wind. The night's snow had changed the rhythm of the farm, transforming it into a landscape of quiet menace, where every step, every sound, and every shadow carried the latent weight of the unseen. And Margaret understood, with a shiver that ran to her very core, that she was entwined in a continuum of observation and disappearance far larger than she could yet comprehend. Margaret Hale could no longer deny the strange undercurrents that ran beneath the Kreider farm. Each day, the invisible threads of observation tightened around her, leaving her aware of patterns she could not fully decipher. The previous Margaret Hale, whose name she had discovered in the brittle letters in the attic, had walked these same floors, performed the same chores, and been watched with the same intensity. Margaret's understanding of her place on the farm began to shift from curiosity to caution. There was a lineage of absence she had inherited, a shadow trailing behind her that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. She wondered what had been lost, and what remained tethered to the land, lingering like a half-forgotten dream. The story of the previous Margaret began to reveal itself in fragments. She had been a young girl, inquisitive and restless, prone to wander the fields alone in the fading light. Rumors whispered among the children spoke of her seeing things in the orchard, listening to voices carried by the wind, and speaking to shadows that did not answer. The adults, Margaret realized, had not dismissed her entirely. They had contained her, watched her, and recorded her absence when she vanished one winter night, swallowed by the cold and snow. Margaret understood now that the Criders had their own language of vigilance, one that extended beyond words, beyond overt warnings. The farm itself had memory, and it demanded compliance, loyalty, and observation from those who lived within its boundaries. Compelled by a need for answers, Margaret returned to the attic under the thin light of late afternoon. The box of letters seemed almost to pulse with history, waiting for her touch. She sifted through the papers, discovering notes and symbols that were more than mere words, cryptic markings etched into the edges of the pages, angular lines forming patterns she did not recognize but that carried a weight of intentionality. The previous Margaret had not only recorded her thoughts, she had tried to encode warnings, messages for those who might follow, for those who would inherit the burden of watching and being watched. Margaret's pulse quickened as she realized the depth of the ritual woven into the farm's daily existence. This was not merely labor, it was preparation, training, containment, a system that had existed long before she arrived and would endure long after. Night fell, and with it came the usual wind. But this time Margaret felt it differently. She walked through the house with heightened awareness, listening to the subtle creaks of timber, the distant sighs of the animals, the muted footsteps of the children retreating to their rooms. The farm seemed alive with memory, each shadow, each corner, each whispered draft of air, a repository of observation. As she approached the edge of the orchard, she hesitated. The tree under which she had glimpsed a lone boy earlier seemed to carry the echo of another presence, a lingering imprint of the girl who had vanished. Margaret could feel it in the soil, faint impressions embedded in the earth, as though the orchard itself remembered the last steps of a soul no longer present. Returning to the farmhouse, she noticed Mrs. Yoder waiting quietly, her expression unreadable. "You have found pieces of her," the woman said softly. "But do not think the puzzle is complete. The farm does not forgive curiosity, and the land does not relinquish its history lightly." Margaret felt the weight of those words press upon her chest, heavy with truth and threat alike. She retired to her cot, listening to the wind and the whispering of branches outside. The presence of the previous Margaret felt tangible now, an unbroken thread of absence that extended into the very air she breathed. The night deepened, and Margaret lay with her mind restless, thinking of the vanished girl. Her imagination mingled with the fragments she had read and observed, creating a tapestry of dread that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The farm itself seemed to pulse with expectation, its rhythms imperceptible yet undeniable, dictating a cadence she had yet to master. In her heart, Margaret knew that she was entwined not only with the present but with the past, and that the whispers of snow, wind, and shadow were not merely sounds but a continuing instruction, that some truths were to be approached with fear, some knowledge carried consequences, and that the farm demanded both observation and obedience in ways she had only begun to understand. The wind carried an unnatural chill that night, cutting across the fields and threading through the farmhouse like an unseen hand. Margaret Hale had become accustomed to the rhythm of the farm, the measured work, the hushed voices, the subtle warnings, but tonight felt different. There was a presence in the air, patient and deliberate, as though the land itself waited for her to acknowledge it. The chores completed, she felt an irresistible pull toward the old barn, a structure whispered about in fragments and avoided by the children after dusk. Every step she took toward it was weighted, measured by a sense of inevitability she could neither name nor resist. The door loomed ahead, partially open, as if inviting her into a space both forbidden and inevitable. Margaret hesitated at the threshold, the cold air brushing against her face and carrying the scent of damp hay, old wood, and something more indefinable, something heavy and ancient that seemed to root itself in her chest. She stepped inside, each movement cautious, aware that the barn held more than the routine of animals and stored harvest. The shadows shifted subtly, as if aware of her intrusion, and the low groan of timber under its own weight sounded like a warning. On the ground, she noticed a broken pot, blackened letters scrawled across its surface spelling Hale. Her pulse quickened, the sound of her own breath sharp against the quiet, yet no one else seemed present. And then the whispers began, soft, murmuring voices, rising and falling in cadence, unintelligible yet deliberate. From the darkness emerged shapes, first indistinct, then slowly resolute. The boy she had glimpsed under the orchard tree appeared, standing rigid beneath the rafters, eyes fixed upon her with a stillness that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Behind him, the Kreider brothers and several other members of the community formed a circle eye, their murmurs blending into the shadows like a single, living entity. Candles, sparse and flickering, illuminated their faces just enough to reveal intent, not emotion. Margaret felt a cold pressure around her, a weight that pressed her toward recognition without permission, an unspoken summons she could neither refuse nor fully comprehend. "You have come to replace the lost soul," one voice said, low and measured, neither accusation nor welcome, but a declaration. The cadence of the words carried the inevitability of tradition, the insistence of ritual. Margaret's heartbeat quickened as comprehension flitted across her mind. She was not merely a visitor or worker here. She had been drawn into a cycle, a continuum that began long before her arrival and continued beyond her understanding. Every movement of the circle, every whispered tone, seemed calculated, a choreography of vigilance and remembrance. The barn itself seemed to bend toward her, amplifying their presence, their expectations, the silent demands of the farm. The circle moved, almost imperceptibly, inwards, narrowing the space, and Margaret felt the air thicken. A pressure of observation pressed on her from every angle, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer, remembering every previous arrival and disappearance. Panic rose within her, a primal response to forces both human and ineffable. She turned, bolted toward the door, and the cold night air struck her like a wave. The barn's warmth, the murmurs, and the weight of the circle receded, leaving her stumbling across the snow toward the orchard's edge. The wind roared in her ears as she ran, and in the distance, she glimpsed a figure beneath the ancient tree, the original Margaret Hale, motionless, pale, an echo in flesh and shadow. Margaret's legs burned with exertion, yet she could not turn her gaze, could not flee the understanding that had just touched her. The farm demanded more than presence. It demanded participation, an unbroken vigilance, and acknowledgement of the invisible order that bound all who entered its fields. Even as the farmhouse disappeared behind her, its quiet authority seemed to trail her, a reminder that the confrontation had not ended, and that the barn, the circle, and the lost soul would follow her in ways she could not yet measure. Hours later, alone in the snow, her breath forming clouds in the frozen air, Margaret understood that she had crossed a threshold. The farm had claimed her attention, if not yet her body, and the whispers, the shapes, and the ancient vigilance would haunt her steps indefinitely. The old barn had revealed not malice, but inevitability, a lesson imparted in shadows and murmurs. And as she finally stumbled back toward the farmhouse, a sense of disquiet settled in her chest, a persistent, quiet awareness that her life and the rhythm of the Kreider farm were now inseparable, bound by the unseen threads of observation, ritual, and the memory of the lost soul. Margaret Hale ran through the night, her breath ragged, the cold snow biting at her cheeks and hands. Each step seemed both urgent and measured, as if the land itself guided her flight, shaping the rhythm of her escape. The orchard loomed behind her, its gnarled branches swaying in the wind like silent witnesses, and the barn faded into the darkness, though its presence lingered in her mind, a reminder of the confrontation she had narrowly escaped. The wind carried whispers, unintelligible yet intimate, pressing against her ears with a weight that was both warning and summons. Margaret did not stop. She could not. The knowledge of the lost soul, of her own place in the continuum of absences, propelled her forward, yet with each step came the gnawing awareness that the escape might be illusory, that the farm had ways of reaching beyond physical boundaries. As she reached the edge of the clearing, where the snow melted into the shadow of the forest, a figure emerged beneath the ancient orchard tree. Margaret froze, heart hammering, for the shape was unmistakable, pale, still, and impossibly real, the original Margaret Hale. The girl's eyes were empty, yet unyielding, fixed on Margaret as if measuring, evaluating, or perhaps summoning her. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of frost and something metallic, something that seemed to belong neither entirely to the snow nor to the living. Margaret's chest tightened, the realization of inevitability settling upon her. This was no mere apparition, no simple memory of absence. It was a presence, patient and immutable, demanding recognition, a sentinel bound to the rhythms of the land and the cycles of loss that the farm meticulously maintained. Margaret stumbled, almost falling into the snow, her mind racing to comprehend the impossibility of what she saw. The figure did not move, did not beckon, yet the weight of its gaze was a force of gravity, anchoring Margaret to the moment with quiet insistence. She wanted to speak, to question, but words seemed futile, lost in the low roar of the wind and the oppressive quiet that surrounded them both. Behind her, the farmhouse and barn were darkened silhouettes, their authority lingering like a tangible force, the children's hushed movements, the adults' silent vigilance, and the invisible measures of ritual stretched across the space between her and the apparition, binding the living and the absent in a continuum she was only beginning to understand. Finally, with a trembling resolve, Margaret turned away, her legs moving of their own volition, carrying her along the narrow path that led to the road out of the Kreider property. The snow muffled her footsteps, yet each print seemed a proclamation, an assertion of both presence and departure, as if the land itself noted the crossing of thresholds. Still, her mind could not abandon the orchard, the figure beneath the tree, the understanding that she was enmeshed in a cycle older and deeper than she could name. The lost soul had not vanished. It lingered in memory, in ritual, and now, in her own consciousness. As dawn approached, casting pale light over the frost-laden fields, Margaret slowed, the adrenaline of escape giving way to a cold, aching awareness. She glimpsed the farmhouse one last time, the silhouettes of the Kreiders and the distant shapes of other observers blending into the horizon. The wind carried a low hum, a continuity that had neither beginning nor end, reminding her that the farm's vigilance extended beyond the tangible. Margaret's chest ached with the knowledge that the lost soul was neither wholly gone nor entirely present, that its truth existed in a space between memory and reality, watching, waiting, and inseparable from the land itself. She pressed forward along the road, carrying both fear and understanding, the invisible threads of the farm entwining around her as the horizon slowly brightened with the first light of day. Even as the forest thinned and the distant town came into view, Margaret could feel the presence lingering, patient, immutable, and unyielding. The Kreider farm, the orchard, the lost soul, all had become part of her consciousness, an enduring truth she could neither deny nor escape. The quiet, the vigilance, the unbroken line of observation, these would accompany her wherever she went, a persistent reminder that some knowledge carries consequences beyond comprehension, and that the land she had entered would continue to measure her, waiting for the day when presence and absence, living and lost, might converge once more. Margaret Hale left the Kreider farm at first light, the frost-laden road stretching endlessly before her. The wind carried the chill of early winter, sharp against her cheeks, yet beneath the cold was a persistent hum, a subtle vibration that seemed to follow her with each step. The farmhouse, the barn, the orchard with its twisted, skeletal tree, all receded into the distance, yet their presence remained, a lingering weight in the periphery of her awareness. Margaret understood now that departure did not sever the ties of observation. The Kreiders, the community, and the land itself continued to watch, measuring her through invisible threads that stretched beyond the reach of sight and sound. The road was quiet, but the air carried a resonance she could not shake. Every footfall seemed to echo with the cadence of absence, a reminder of the lost soul she had glimpsed, a presence suspended between life and memory. She thought of the attic, the brittle letters inscribed with warnings and names, the cryptic symbols etched into paper as though to communicate a reality just beyond comprehension. Each fragment of knowledge had led her to this flight, yet the understanding it offered was incomplete, unsettling, and persistent. The wind rustled the bare branches, lining the road, the sound almost human in its cadence, whispering secrets she could not interpret, yet could not ignore. As she approached the edge of the distant town, her pace slowed, but the sensation of being observed intensified. Somewhere along the snow-streaked fields, a figure appeared and vanished, a shadow too deliberate to dismiss as imagination. Margaret's heart quickened, her breath forming clouds that mingled with the whispering wind. She recalled the orchard tree, the boy who had stood beneath it, and the pale, immobile form of the original Margaret Hale. The figure had not moved, had not called, yet its gaze had followed her, pressing upon her with the gravity of inevitability. The echo of that presence extended beyond the boundaries of the farm, and Margaret felt it tethered to her own consciousness, a reminder that absence and presence were intertwined, and that the past lingered like a living memory in the rhythm of the land. The town emerged slowly, buildings silhouetted against the pale morning. Yet Margaret's attention remained split between the tangible path and the invisible threads reaching back toward the Kreider farm. She realized with a tightening in her chest that she carried the weight of both curiosity and survival, that her flight had not freed her, but had placed her within a continuum of observation, ritual, and expectation. Every step forward was measured against the rhythm of those who had come before, every breath a testimony to a cycle that had begun long before her and would continue long after. She paused at a fork in the road, the horizon stretching endlessly before her, and felt the presence once more, the subtle hum, the invisible vigilance, the unyielding persistence of the lost soul. Margaret understood that she could not escape entirely. Some truths were woven into the land itself, carried in shadows, whispers, and memory. Her life and the Kreider farm were now inextricably linked, bound by the quiet insistence of observation, the unresolved weight of absence, and the ritual of vigilance that demanded recognition. Margaret pressed onward, each step deliberate, her chest heavy with the knowledge that the echoes of the farm, of the lost soul, and of the invisible watchers would accompany her always. The wind carried them, the snow held them, and the horizon stretched beyond her sight, a continuum of presence and absence, a reminder that some stories are never concluded, some truths never released, and that vigilance, silent, patient, and inexorable, would endure wherever she went. Even as the town came into full view, the awareness lingered, a persistent echo threading through her mind, her body, her very understanding of the world. Margaret Hale had left the Kreider farm, but the Kreider farm had not left her.